Our first part of our lecture is going to be on Chapter 15, which is looking at social and cultural constraints in motor development. We've talked about several social and cultural constraints. Usually we said, oh, these are these are extrinsic factors that could potentially modify how somebody develops in a certain way. So I think in previous ones we said diet and exercise, right? But what are the things that are influencing those extrinsic factors? Or what is constraining other constraints? Whoa, right? So this is going to be our first section is social and cultural or sociocultural constraints, and then the next half of our lecture is going to be on psychosocial constraints, which psychology, I know it's a huge thing and we haven't really touched on that so much. Maybe hinted at it in the lecture last week when we talked about, was that last week? I think that was last week, when we talked about motor competence or perceived motor competence. We just didn't dive into it super a lot. So we're going to do some more of that this week. But let's start with our social and cultural influences as environmental constraints. So remember, these are happening external to the person or the individual, and they don't require, or I guess maybe they don't pertain so much to the information about the task specifically. So taking it back to like one of the very first lectures, we have individual, task, and environmental constraints. Both task and environmental were external to the person, right? But task constraints are specifically about or giving information about how you perform a certain task or things or equipment that are needed for that task, right? So these are those external constraints that are not related specifically to the task, but might influence the task indirectly or motor behaviors indirectly just by existing external to the individual. From an environmental perspective, we already know, right, environmental being the Newell's model or kind of the major theory that we've been kind of pointing at this entire semester. We know there are links between the individual, task, and environment, and sometimes these links can be a little bit more fluid than others or less clear-cut, but they do constrain or guide development, right? We're either permitting a certain behavior or we're limiting a person to a certain behavior. So we've talked about some social and cultural factors, but generally what we say these represent, right, are an attitude or belief of society or subcultures, or it could be an attitude of an individual that have an effect on how a person develops their motor behavior. So different examples of this could be gender roles, right? That's a huge one that we've talked about, where we say, oh, girls participate in dance and gymnastics, where boys participate in football and baseball, that type of thing. So how do gender roles in society, right, or it could even be cultural gender roles as well, where you have more traditional tasks that people are involved in, and in America we are all about the woman empowerment and kind of creating greater equality between genders, and creating greater equality between the possibilities of things that both genders can do. But some cultures are not, they don't promote that, right? And that's totally fine. It's a difference in culture, and diversity is great. But some cultures just have traditional views on gender and what each gender should do. So it's larger than just the social or what society in general thinks versus what a specific culture might think in terms of gender roles. We also have personal influencers that are a part of this sociocultural influences niche. So this could be parents, role models, teachers, friends, siblings, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Cultural practices might affect, like how you engage in certain activities. So maybe people whose religion is a huge part of their culture, and their religion tells them they need to take a rest day out of the week, or maybe they're fasting for a while and they're kind of supposed to limit their activity. I don't know. I'm not an expert in all religions, but things like that, or certain religious restrictions that are part of a person's culture, could influence how they interact with different elements in their environment or different people in their environment. We also have social stereotypes that are linked to different social and cultural factors. Economic status, right? Do you have the resources? And then we also have social media. This could also be included as access to social media, but social media, especially in like this day and age where we're technological generations coming up here, and we've got all of these different platforms that can influence how we engage with the world. I think TikTok is, it's been booming, and I think this is a great example of, having trendy dances, and then people are like, ooh, that's fun, I want to do that, and now they're engaging in motor behavior, right? So there can be really positive influences from social media. Also negative ones, but we'll circle back to that. But I just want to give kind of like an overarching example of how culture might impact or constrain behaviors, right? And we can look at sumo wrestling as an example. I know that kind of like came out of left field, but if you think about sumo, right, or sumo wrestlers, those people are athletes in Japanese culture. And that particular culture might encourage choices that lead to competing in sumo wrestling. So that's Japan's like cultural idea of an athlete. But in opposition, we have American culture that identifies athletes as lean and agile individuals, or typically in like mainstream athletics, and we typically encourage people to engage in certain behaviors to pursue their American sport of interest, right? So two different cultures might treat athletes very similar and or different ways, because people also play similar sports, in Japan as there are in America. But in general, that's a pretty good example of how culture can play a role as a constraint in the types of behaviors that a person engages with. When we look at how cultural or social influences are going to impact a person, early exposure is key. And we refer to this as the socialization process. Okay, so early socialization in sport or physical activity plays a larger role in motor development, or just a large role in motor development, and likelihood of later participation in physical activity. So you guys might remember last week we talked about the motor competence, excuse me, the motor competence and the physical activity loop that people get into, right? The more physical activity you do, the better fitness or better body composition you might have, which might make it easier to do physical activity. The more and more you engage in physical activity, the more motor competence you have, or the feelings that, like you're confident in your abilities to do certain types of physical behaviors, which then points you back to engaging in physical activity more. Okay. This doesn't only apply to sport and activity, though. It could be cognitive activities as well, such as study habits or brain games. It could also apply to social activities, like hanging out with friends or being a loner, right? That also is kind of just part of personality things as well, because I know as a kid, I was probably like 90% introvert and was a loner most of the time. And I think that came from like I was bullied as a kid, so I think that just came from people picking on me, and I was like, well, it's kind of easier just not to deal with people if I can avoid it, because it's always a negative experience. So again, that's like people in your area, right? Social activities kind of contributing to how you behave or the level of engagement that you show in different activities. I think past first or second grade, I don't know if you guys ever played Foursquare on the playground, but I would have like this group of girls. Oh my god, they were so evil. They would intentionally get me out on like the first bounce, and I was like, guys, I just want to play. I want to do what you guys do, like I just want to be a part of the people. And I went to a school that, there was only like 14 kids in my class, so It was small to begin with. There weren't a lot of options, basically. But I think past first grade, I just was so fed up with being treated poorly that I chose to stay in the teacher's classroom at break times. Like, recess was the worst part of the day for me, and I feel like that's completely opposite for a lot of other people. But just engaging with other people in your environment, right, can really play a role. It could be an acute experience that plays a role on how you engage. It could be over a longer period of time or more of a chronic exposure. But these things, the socialization early on when you are first exposed to a certain process or a certain activity, can really, really, really have an effect on how you engage with that activity later down the road. So, in terms of like a concrete definition, we call the socialization process a process by which one learns a social role in groups with certain values, morals, and rules. So, society has values, morals, and rules. The socialization process is how we learn all of those things within a social setting. So there's three major elements that are going to lead to an individual learning their societal role. Right, so societal role here. We have socializing agents, which could be, oh my god, my pointer, family, peers, coaches, teachers, pretty much anyone who's going to have influence or people that you would socialize with. We have social situations, which is more the places where the socialization takes place, right? So if you're playing games with people, if you have toys, what is the play environment, right? If you've got a playground versus a very tiny tree house, or because we know, like, maybe what are the tools in the environment, that type of thing. So social situations. And then the last thing that contributes to a person understanding their social role is personal attributes. So these could be more along the lines of individual functional constraints, such as a person's strength, their skill, or motivation to do a task, their perceived ability. So even though, we've got other like external things, I think it's still important to emphasize that the linkage between individual constraints is still pretty prevalent when in this conversation. Okay. So we're going to go through each of these kind of one by one to see how they would affect the social role. We'll first start with gender-specific stereotyped behaviors. So I kind of think that the information on this slide is not new to anyone, but it's important to revisit anyways. The first thing we need to point out is that sex is different from gender. And I think in gender equality conversations that go on in the world, this is becoming a more well-known difference. But sex is it's biologically determined, right? Are you male or are you female based on the sex characteristics, or the primary sex characteristics that you were born with? Gender, however, is a part of a person's identity. So it's a sociological construct. If you've got people who were born a female, but they have realized in themselves that they are more in line with, I guess, maybe what a man would be, and that this kind of gets into very murky territory, because then it's like, well, what is the idea of a man? What is the idea of a woman? And so I think it's kind of interesting when we look at sex and gender identity, because part of the social influence goes into how you identify, right? Typically we say that men are associated with more masculinity, females more femininity. And so if you have a man that identifies more with femininity and feels within themselves that they are more female than male in terms of gender, then that in some way is going to be influenced by the existing social norms. And so in Western society, gender typing or gender role stereotyping is big, 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 big thing, right? And it occurs when a significant other, which, could be parent, teacher, sibling, friend, etc. It's when a significant other encourages activities that are deemed gender appropriate. Okay, and so gender typing typically is going to steer individuals towards their perceived gender based on a person's sex and not necessarily their gender identity. So typically with girls, right, when we look at clothing or toys or, marketing strategies, typically there are more feminine colors associated with girl objects, right? So they put in colors of pink or purple or pastel colors, things that have softer or gentler tones, versus boys have more bold colors like blue or red. Heaven forbid they be associated with pink, which is one of the things I love about my husband because his favorite color is pink, and I think that is awesome. Pink is a great color. It's not even my favorite color. My favorite color is green, but besides the point, color is a huge way that maybe we don't notice as, so often. I mean, baby showers, perfect example. Is it a girl, gender reveal is pink. If it's a boy, gender reveal, it's blue. So we adopt these these color schemes before people are even born, It's crazy. But also gender typing can play a role in what types of toys you play with. Girls play with baby dolls and play house, Here's a kitchen set. Learn how to cook with plastic. I feel like at least that's what I actually really enjoyed doing that as a kid. But anyways, but those are kind of the things that are pushed at us to put women in more house role or get them introduced to housekeeping tasks early on. Versus boys, it's go play sports and you rough play or wrestle with other people. Here's a ball and a bat. Go hit something, hit a ball, not just, I'm not promoting violence. I just want to be clear about that. But the types of recreational activities that we encourage our kids to engage in are usually gender typed, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. Also, the different types of sports that we encourage people or enroll our kids in. We already mentioned this one. Girls do dance, gymnastics, cheer, yoga, maybe Zumba or bar classes, things that are considered more feminine. Boys play, football, basketball, things that add to their societal masculinity. Okay. Also, phrases that we use with people can apply to gender typing. Hey, you should act like a lady. That's not ladylike. Oh my God, if I had a dime let's raise the stakes. If I had $1 for every time somebody told me to act like a lady, I'm bruh, I'm a kid. Let me just be a kid. I don't need to be proper at 5 years old, But also, this could go other ways, right? Where we say that boys need to be chivalrous, and opening doors for women or assisting them with heavy lifting. I have brought up that I hate this, and that's a biased opinion. I'm okay, putting it out there because I think it's important you guys don't have to have the same opinions as me, but just to understand that these are things that exist. This is something that I've noted that my husband does to me often whenever we take out the trash because we have to kind of walk to get to our dumpsters, but he will always take the heavier pile. And I was like, why don't you let me take the heavier pile every once in a while? I am physically capable of carrying something. I might have to set it down halfway to the dumpster because my hand grip gets tired or my arm gets tired, but I can still do it. And boys, you might have a very different perspective on this, and that is totally fine. I'm coming from a female perspective. I can add certain biases, but you guys don't have to adopt them. Okay? We can also look at gender typing in terms of household chores, right? Boys typically take out the trash, mow the lawn. Girls do household cleaning or laundry, that type of thing. Okay, so recognizing gender typing and mixing it up is a good thing. My personal experience growing up, I lived with 2 other females. my mom and my sister. My dad, I have a very, very interesting family dynamic because my parents were never married. They just have been best friends for like 30 or 40 years now. So my dad was never living with us, so I didn't have a very strong like male influence growing up in my early years. He would still do birthdays and holidays, and he actually would come home come to our house like every single weekend to hang out with us and do activity type stuff. But for the most part, my primary influences were female influences. And the types of activities that I engaged in were very diverse in terms of what typical gender role stereotyping would suggest. I still did things because, I loved playing with Barbie dolls and Polly Pockets or whatever. My sister loved playing with G.I. Joes, right? Different type of doll, action figure, whatever you want to call it. And we each had our own preferences, and my mom was totally fine with that. But we both had the opportunity to engage in different types of sports that were either considered masculine or feminine. I have shared that with you guys. Where she would say, Natalie, do you want to play basketball like Vanessa? And I was like, yeah, I'll try it. God, I suck. No, not for me, And she told my sister, do you want to dance like Natalie? And then Vanessa came in, found out she had to wear a dress for her costume and said, not for me, So how we introduce these stereotypes, if we introduce them at all, is super, super important in influencing future behaviors. Or, I guess, generally what we view as certain gender roles, if we have gender roles at all. I think society as a whole is kind of trying to move away from that, at least on a more liberal side of thinking, where, we're kind of pushing like equality for all. But I think this stereotyping definitely is not as prominent. It still exists, but it's not as prominent in today's society as it, may have been like 10 years ago, maybe even early as 5 years ago. In terms of some research that's related to this information, physical activity influences physiological development, right? Sex differences might be more related to stereotyped influences than we know. In this particular part of the chapter, if females are not encouraged to reach their full physical potential because of any of the examples that I just presented, that's kind of like a major finding in sociocultural motor development research, okay, is that females are just not pushed as hard as males are. There was another study that looked at athletes versus non-athletes' upbringing. Usually athlete groups had early participation in more deemed masculine activities, and or they had mixed influences. So I think my sister is a good example of an athletic group. Like, she played tennis, basketball, she did track and field. Those were like the main ones that she did in high school, but she was an all-season athlete, always engaged in a lot of stuff. And that's because my dad played a lot of ball sports with her growing up and encouraged her to do things that were considered more masculine. Versus me, I wanted to, play house with my mom and help her cook in the kitchen, which there's nothing wrong with that. But you can clearly see, like, I was also an athlete. I think dancers are incredible athletes. I ended up still being engaged in activity, but it was just at a different capacity than my sister was. So she was in the more masculine athletic activities. I was in more feminine considered athletic activities. But both of us had mixed influences, and that pushed us to engage in physical activity. So knowing that activity influences our physiological development and how this linkage is important, which we've talked about in terms of physical activity, playing into motor competence, playing into your perception of self, that type of thing, making sure that we don't stereotype how people are engaging in those physical activities does have a bigger impact than we might think it does.